A routine grocery store trip in Compton, California, turned into a moment no one there would forget. It was a sunny afternoon, and the store buzzed with shoppers weaving through the aisles, engrossed in their errands. Among them was rapper Snoop Dogg, dressed casually in a blue Compton hoodie and jeans, carrying a basket of groceries while texting on his phone. Nearby, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson stood in the produce section, carefully adjusting her glasses as she reached for a bag of apples. Her demeanor seemed ordinary, but what unfolded next was anything but. Mrs. Thompson, likely in her late 70s, noticed Snoop as he reached for a bag of oranges. Her expression shifted, her narrowed eyes and tight lips signaling disapproval. Then in a voice loud enough for others to hear, she said, "You people don't belong here." The air seemed to freeze. Shoppers paused, some exchanging uncomfortable glances, while others pretended not to notice. Snoop stopped mid-motion, his fingers hovering over his phone. He looked up, and Mrs. Thompson, unrelenting, added, "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Snoop's brow furrowed as he processed her words. For a moment it seemed like he might respond with anger, but instead he took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Thompson stood firm, clutching her apples defiantly. Around them, shoppers became an audience, unsure of how to intervene, but unwilling to look away. Snoop straightened his posture, setting his basket down carefully. His voice, when it came, was calm and deliberate, cutting through the tension. "Ma'am," he began, "do you even realize what you just said?" His tone wasn't accusatory but reflective, as if giving her a chance to reconsider. She didn't. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." The room seemed to hold its breath. A young mother steered her child away, an older man near the potatoes glanced nervously, and a store employee stacking bananas froze mid-motion. The weight of her words lingered, heavy and inescapable. Snoop's gaze remained steady. "You said I don't belong here," he replied, his voice firm but measured. "Let me tell you something about where I come from." He straightened, his presence commanding attention. "My great-great-grandfather was born right here in California," he began, "but before that, my ancestors were brought here against their will. They worked as slaves to build this very state, this country you're standing in." Mrs. Thompson's lips tightened, but she stayed silent. The crowd listened intently as Snoop continued, his words gaining strength. "My grandfather fought in Korea, risking his life for a country that denied him basic rights when he came home. He couldn't sit at the same counters or drink from the same fountains, but he stayed because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." The room was utterly still, every ear attuned to his voice. "And my parents," Snoop went on, his tone softening but losing none of its power, "fought in their own way. My mother, a teacher, spent her life educating kids about equality. My father, a community leader, has always helped others, no matter who they are." He paused, letting his words sink in. "So, when you tell me I don't belong here," he said, his voice tinged with sadness, "you're wrong. I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears." Mrs. Thompson's face flushed. She clutched her apples tightly, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth to speak but seemed unable to find the words. Snoop took a small step back, his composure unwavering. "I could have walked away," he said, addressing the crowd now. "But ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to be better than words like those." A middle-aged man in a baseball cap stepped forward. "He's right," he said, breaking the silence. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to unlock the room. Others nodded, murmured agreements spreading through the crowd. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle spoke softly. "My dad fought in the same war. He always said the only color that matters is the red on the flag." The murmurs grew louder. A young cashier called out from her station, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully." "Thank you," Mrs. Thompson glanced around, searching for support but finding none. The fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of shame. Without another word, she wheeled her cart toward the exit, her steps unsteady. Snoop watched her go, then turned back to pick up his basket. A woman approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Thank you for saying what needed to be said, she said quietly. Snoop nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes, he replied, it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure the truth is heard. As the crowd dispersed, the atmosphere in the store felt different, quieter, more reflective. People returned to their shopping, but the impact of Snoop's words lingered. Later that evening, he recounted the incident to his friends. You did the right thing, one of them said. Ignorance doesn't change overnight, but you planted a seed. Across town, Mrs. Thompson sat at her dining table, Snoop's words replaying in her mind. For the first time, doubt crept into her thoughts. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. The story of what happened spread through the community, sparking conversations about prejudice, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Snoop's calm dignity had left an indelible mark, proving that sometimes grace and truth can create the biggest impact of all.